Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association, and I am honored to have with me today Colonel Kyle Pumroy, the commander of Delta 11. Sir, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Hippie. I'm happy to be here.
And sir, just so the audience understands who you are, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your career and how you ended up as the Del 11 commander?
Yeah, I'm commander of Space Forces Delta 11. We're the Space Range and Space Aggressors Delta. We provide all the range capacities and aggressor capacities for the Space Force and our mission partners. So I ended up here, started off my space career in electronic warfare at the 4th Space Control Squadron, deployed a few times out of there, had some good downrange experience. And that played well then for squadron commander with the 527th Space Aggressors, which is also an electronic warfare unit. So I have the background there. Was at the time our only range and aggressor units were for electronic warfare. I followed that assignment with some Pentagon tours and a tour at the Combined Space Operations Center, where it's also tied to command and control over electronic warfare and then the gamut of space capabilities. And then when the Space Force identified a need to stand up a Delta for range and aggressors and stand up new squadrons for orbital warfare range and orbital warfare aggressors, my aggressor experience probably played into making me a fair choice to stand up the Delta as we stand up those new units and capabilities.
Thank you, sir. Yes, that is a perfect career, I would suspect, for commanding Del 11, being the first commander of Delta 11. And you mentioned that within the Delta, you've got a couple of different organizations. Can you talk a little bit about each of those?
Yeah, so right now, 5 squadrons, and our mission sets are orbital warfare and electronic warfare. So as I mentioned, range and aggressors, we have an orbital warfare range squadron that just stood up this summer. That's the 98th Space Range Squadron. They provide capacities to do test and training on orbit with our what we call our min viable product orbital warfare range, which is a collection of sensors and data servers and visualization tools so that we can maintain essentially a persistent look on assets at GEO so that we know whether they're performing properly under test, performing properly under training, and can make decisions whether to continue with tests or continue with training. Also on the orbital warfare side, we have the 57th Space Aggressor Squadron, which is our new orbital warfare aggressor squadron. So they're responsible for playing the adversary in exercises like space flag and weapon school exercises, focused on co-orbital threats and direct descent threats to our Guardians. Right now, that's fully virtual. We do that in a number of virtual environments, but we are looking to see at one point perhaps having satellites that either are aggressor assets or aggressors buy time on to represent threats for, again, test or training opportunities that our Guardians need, but done in a safe and secure way on the 98th Space Range Squadron's range capacities. On the electronic warfare side, we have the 25th Space Range Squadron, which has been around since, I believe, 2004. They provide environments to do EW training for our electronic warfare units in Space Force, as well as our other services that come to work on the range, where we can put live bandwidth out to do energy on energy training. They also have some virtual capabilities that we can plug into and do higher end training and test on. And then we have the 527th Space Aggressor Squadron, which is our electronic warfare aggressors, which will do everything from GPS interference to satellite communications interference, training with both Guardians who operate satellite communication capabilities, all the way to remotely piloted aircraft flyers and showing them the vulnerabilities, how to mitigate those vulnerabilities in training. And then lastly, we have our 11 Delta Operational Support Squadron, or the DOS, and that essentially does all the kind of staff functions and like on the Air Force side, your OSS functions for the Delta. And so they have a synchronization and integration mission set within that squadron to ensure that we're integrated across orbital warfare, electronic warfare. They're bringing on a scheduling capability as the range requirements begin to increase with our customer base, and all your standard staff functions.
That is quite a list of responsibilities in the organization. And what's unique, it seems, is that you represent a large set of mission areas in one delta that is typically strewn across many deltas within SPOC. And so, can you talk a little bit about that? In the past, we've had the opportunity to talk with Colonel Beard about force packaging and the importance of force packaging. Can you talk a little bit about how you prepare operators and guardians to either one, force package, or learn lessons from some of their force packaging designs?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, on the SPOC side, on the Space Operations Command side, we specialize in missile warning or orbital warfare or cyber in specific deltas. But in Delta 11, we have multiple missions to include cyber, orbital warfare, and electronic warfare. So that drives the ability to integrate those things in from a range perspective, so we can synchronize different disciplines and range capacities to allow for force package solutions to be tested and trained on. And similarly, we can bring in multi-access aggressors into training scenarios and have OW aggressors and EW aggressors fight blue, just like we would expect the Chinese or Russians to do. So I like to think that within this delta, because we have all those capacities in one command, that we can be the thought leaders for multi-discipline integration. So as on the SPOC side, they might specialize. On our side, we're forced to integrate and allowed to integrate because we have such close proximity between our squadrons, although we have different specialties. Within the DOS and with me, I can drive the integration that supports force package solution ideas and how we test them out and how we train them in the future.
Thank you. No, that's really important, especially when you consider the cyber component. So is that something also that's represented in your Delta, is intelligence and cyberspace? Because there's been a lot of discussion from leaders, including General Whiting at Space Operations Command, about the importance of understanding cyber vulnerability. So is that something you look at as well?
It is, absolutely. And we've actually started up our cyber aggressor mission underneath the 527 Space Aggressor Squadron. So we don't have a squadron dedicated to it, but we do have a flight dedicated to it right now. And we're building out the training for those aggressors. They did their first event, which is a really kind of basic event during a space flag exercise this past spring, and it was very successful, and our training audience learned a lot. And we're scaling that for a future space flag exercise where we bring that in and have a representative environment of a space network, and our aggressors will come in and try to shut it down or have impacts on it, and we'll put defenders on that network trying to keep the aggressors out of there. And so we're doing that now. We're looking to scale that mission up. We expect to have more billets given to us in FY24 to round out that capacity. And at the same time, through STARCOM, we're acquiring cyber range capacities as well. And so within the next year to 2 years, we'll have our own cyber enclaves that we can put our own emulations of space networks on that have a dedicated range capacity that we can include in space flag exercises, red flag exercises, you name it, that's focused on the Guardian and defending networks. And allow the aggressors to go in and find vulnerabilities against our Guardians and hone those skills. And so, yeah, we're really integrated across cyber, OW, EW right now, but we're at the initial stages, right? These are a handful of people starting up these missions, but we have more billets coming in the future and more investments coming in the future, and we're focused on making it as real as possible for the Guardian, for the Space Warfighter.
Thank you. You talked a lot about space flag and red flag, or at least mentioned it. From your perspective, could you just provide an overview for our audience about the differences between red flag and what space flag is?
Right. Yeah. So red flag is, an Air Force-owned exercise that's looks to bring in many different aircraft to accomplish, again, force packaged objectives. the training needs and advanced training needs that our air forces need before they go into their combat cycle, so that they're familiar with the most relevant tactics and threats that they're going to see before they are ready to engage in an adversary. And the Air Force has been doing red flag since 1975, and is a big contributor to the success the Air Force has had over the almost past 50 years. And so a few years ago, we looked to start up a space flag that was really emulated off the lessons learned from red flag, where we too bring our domain-focused force package fighting against realistic threats and thinking adversaries to hone the skills, to build readiness in our space forces, and to learn how best to fight against certain threats from our adversaries. And so, for those that have done red flags before, that's mostly or often, flown live on the Nevada Test and Training Range with real aircraft, with real electronic attack, and all those elements. Right now, space flag is done virtually in a simulated environment, but we keep looking to get the most we can out of that environment and the most realism as we can get, and still maintain that distance between red and blue, so that we have a thinking adversary that's trying to defeat blue, and blue fails, and we learn from it and identify new ways to implement countermeasures against realistic threats.
Fail fast, as the story goes, as the saying goes. You talked about the Nevada Test and Training Range. Excuse me. Can you talk a little bit about what you're developing out there in creating a training range environment?
Yeah. As we stood up a space force and been investing in space capabilities we need now that space is not a benign environment, identified we have to figure out whether or not those systems we invest in work, and we need credibility in those systems, right? Right now, the Nevada Test and Training Range on the test side, that's how you know weapon systems are credible, because you fly them out on a range, you collect the data, and you identify if they met the objectives. We've never had that for space, besides on the electronic warfare side to a degree. Similarly, on the combat preparation side, the credibility that goes into the warfighter comes from their experience on the range, where they have a realistic combat engagement, as we mentioned, like in red flag. And so again, we've never had that for space. A major deficiency if space is going to be a warfighting environment, and we know it is. And so the Space Force has invested in building out what we call the National Space Test and Training Complex, which will be a collection of range capacities that allow us to do tests on systems and collect data where we didn't have capability before, and then ultimately to do realistic combat training, both live and virtually, so we can identify where the weaknesses is in our force and focus on those weaknesses, and then we are essentially make readiness real, so that when we say that our combat forces are ready in the Space Force, we can trace that back to threats and the experience they had, so that we know that their credibility is real, or their credibility is real, and the readiness is real. And so we're in the initial stages of building that out under the NSTTC, the National Space Test and Training Complex, building out 4 elements to that: an orbital warfare element, the electronic warfare element, the cyber element, and the digital element. And all of those then will be packaged into one big range complex that Delta 11 will be responsible for on the as the owner operator for those capabilities.
That's great to hear. And from a TTP perspective, is this something that this range that's going to be created, is this a place where folks can go and develop tactics, techniques and procedures, or TTPs, for their respective systems? And how important is that to the overall fight?
Yeah, absolutely. That's in a lot of ways where kind of the seam between test and training is that TTP development, and it's two-way. That right, we have a credible capability. The warfighter knows how to operate it, but is there more you can get out of that system, or is there new information based on threats that help redefine how you operate that system? And absolutely, when we identify those needs for TTP development or refining tactics or testing if a tactic will be successful as it's been formulated, then our ranges will become the proving ground that you can take the threat, take the capability, and see if the hypothesis is true, to see if that tactic is appropriate and works. And then that feedback then goes back into our what we call our tactics development program, and then all the way to our doctrine program, which the Space Force has also set up under STARCOM so that we can capture those lessons.
That's great to hear. Can you talk about, I know General Saltzman has been talking about this for a while since he was the COO and now he's the CSO, has been talking about the need for advanced training, realistic advanced training environment for Guardians. Can you talk about a vignette that would be an example of something that you would be providing a training venue for in either a space flag or other situation?
Yeah, I think, think about this for a second. What I perceive in the next maybe 1 to 3 years is an ability to have a threat surrogate on orbit that's not going to do any threatening, but it might have the dimensions and the orbitology of something on orbit that we're concerned about. At the same time, we'll have range capacities that can watch a certain volume of space and see how things work out. And then we'll have an asset on orbit that needs to take defensive actions. And perhaps it's a service retain capability that has fuel on it that we can do real defensive actions, right? And so we can run through a scenario where we do an approach in a safe way. We can identify when our sensors see that threat's coming, so that we have a non-witting training audience. And then that can feed a command control enterprise to make decisions on how we're going to defend against that threat and perhaps maneuver out of the way and what type of maneuver we'll do, and see if the timelines support defense against that threat. And then we'll be able to capture all that data, be able to play it back and see what happened, much like for those who have done red flags before, you do a high-speed playback of the event. We would be able to do the same and watch in real time as decisions were made, as actions were made, and we can learn if we think we were successful in how we defended against a threat, or if we failed. And if we failed, identify why did we fail? Are our command and control processes too slow? Are our capabilities just not defendable? What is it we can do to be more cognizant of that threat and better respond to that threat? So I think that's something we'll see in the near term with our aggressors and our range. And then you layer in everything else we have into that, right? You can throw an electronic warfare fight into that scenario on top of it. You can throw cyber on top of electronic warfare on top of that orbital warfare fight. And so in theory, we could do that all live. Now, I don't know that we will or won't. That there's a lot of decisions we got to make if we can do that in a safe, secure way, and in a way that doesn't give the impression that we're trying to start a fight in space, right? Because this is really about understanding what's happening and being able to make decisions. And so the other side of that is the digital enterprise. And as we build out the digital enterprise for our range, for those things that we think are maybe overly or too provocative, or we're not confident in the safety security, then we'll have a realistic digital environment where we can do the same thing inside. And that we have confidence in the models, we have confidence in our threat models, we have confidence in our blue models, we have confidence that all the physics are purely representative of what would happen in the space environment, and then we can learn from that way as well. And so we'll have the live side and the virtual side within the digital aspect of the range as opportunities for whatever scenario it is we need to play out. But on our end, we want to be imaginative and see what we can do live, because that's where the most learning comes from, and then default over to virtual when it's just not supportable to do in a live environment.
And so you bring up a good point. Nobody wants a war that starts or extends into space. Just to be very clear, nobody wants that. It's not good for anybody. At the same time, like you said, you're helping to prepare the generation of space warfighters that will have to defend that domain to ensure freedom of action in that domain. as the commander of Del 11 responsible for advanced training, how do those lessons learned actually flow back into a process so that you can fix those perceived problems in the future and don't have those in the future?
Yeah, I think that gets on a really close relationship that we'll have and continue to develop with Delta 10, our doctrine and wargaming Delta, that as we will provide the environments for the events. And so events might be put on by Delta 1, our training Delta. We might put on an event if it's smaller scale. But particularly if we're looking to learn from the event, then that's when we want to pull in our Delta 10 partners that are going to have a responsibility for both concept development and doctrine, so that we can feed lessons, we can feed what we're learning into the doctrine enterprise. But then not just funnel it solely to them and stovepipe it, and then that we find a way that our immediate results, our immediate findings are shared with our training audience, shared with ourselves, shared with STARCOM, shared over to SPOC. And so the ways and the means in which we're doing that, I think Delta 10 is working through of how we can better share that information and data. But we're always looking for that coming out of an event to say, what was some major things that we identified that our training audience learned, and what's our best way to make sure that information gets promulgated across the force. And so that, I think that just goes to the synchronization across STARCOM that we've got to do, that when we have the events and in a realistic environment with a thinking adversary, that the learning then is captured immediately on the doctrine side within STARCOM.
Sir, that's a large task that you've got in your organization. Do you have, or in an ideal world, do you have all the resources necessary to accomplish it? And I suspect it's a throughput issue, meaning it's probably the more resources you have, probably the more exercises you can facilitate. So at this point, what are your current numbers, if you can share them? And do you expect to grow those numbers in the future?
Yeah. Right now, when you look at our workforce to include contractor support, we're right around about 180. But even with billets allocated, and that's actually before FY23. We have a number of new billets coming in now that we're in through October, none of which we've hired against, obviously. So new billets coming in FY23 and 24, as well as additional contractor support. So we expect to grow to somewhere in the mid 400s over the next 3 years, at least billet wise. But across the Space Force, obviously we have more billets than people as we try to build out the force. So we expect by FY24 somewhere around 450, maybe a little bit more than that, and maybe with contractors we could reach close to 500 authorizations to include contractors. But the reality, I think, will be 100 or so less than that, just from billets we're not able to fill because of the size of the force. But then I think over time, especially you get within 8 to 10 years from now, as the force grows, then those billets will get closer to be filled, and we'll do more with the mission. So from a manpower side, we have some squadrons that are just a dozen people, but they know they're getting a dozen more people this coming year and a dozen more after that. So they're building from the ground up these capabilities. So what do we have today? Not a whole lot, but we have the resources that we expect to come, and we're funded. And the big part of the mission for our new units right now is just to pave the way for the next generation of their squadron to operate and scale what they've started within their first 1 or 2 years of existence.
Thank you. You talked about basically operational checkout prior to deployment, or their operational tour for the air domain. In the space domain, is there going to be the same type of requirement levied upon Guardians in Space Operations Command to go through advanced training prior to conducting their warfighting mission?
Yeah, I absolutely see that coming. I think it's in development now. The Space Force has moved to a force generation model where there's meant to be a cycle to where you're committed as a presented force to U.S. Space Com or perhaps another combat command. And then after your commit phase, you roll back in and you go into a readiness building phase. And so as the dust settles is trying to implement that model, I'm certain that we'll have spin up requirements that apply to forces in what we call the ready phase before they go into commit. And I think that's where we're going to start focusing almost all of our energy on the advanced training requirements that take a non-committed force and declare it as being ready. And because in order to really declare that you're ready, you have to see realistic combat situations and scenarios, and that's going to have to happen on a range, and it's going to have to happen with a thinking adversary. And so I think we're trying to implement it now. I think it's obviously a big shift for the Space Force, and it'll take time. But I certainly think in the next year we're going to start figuring out how we synchronize with the force generation cycles of SPOC's units, so that we're ready to provide them the range and aggressor capacities they need before they put forces into the commit phase. So I think we will be very directly tied to SPOC in their readiness building model.
It's so important what you're doing in terms of ensuring the operators have a realistic environment to train on, to get ready for conducting their defined space superiority mission. So thanks for doing that. And I tell you, I don't know how many exercises you're going to have to go through in the future, and if the numbers that you currently have can ensure that those forces are prepared. But I know you're the right person for the job, sir. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the audience about the important mission of Delta 11?
Well, I hit on the kind of multi-disciplines that we do within this Delta, where we have a cyber mission, we have an EW mission, and an OW mission. But really, when you look at range and you look at aggressors, what I see is we are not an operations Delta, and we're not an intelligence Delta, and we're not a cyber Delta. We're all those things, because we have to operationalize intelligence. Right? I could see someone doing my job could be an intelligence professional, they could be an operations professional, and they could be a cyber professional, because we can't just rely on being operators, because we have to represent what we see the adversaries do. So there's a big tie to intelligence there. And so I think I would highlight that what's unique about this Delta is that we have a big mix of intelligence, cyber, space operations professionals, and engineers under one hat. Synchronizing and integrating together, to where some of that career intelligence or career space ops starts to diminish a little bit, and you start kind of incorporating the intelligence mindset and vice versa, because we work so tightly together. And I think that's critical if we're going to provide those realistic environments and thinking adversaries, that we have to be unique in that way, that we have to open our horizons, be intellectually curious, not just think of ourselves as space operators or cyber professionals or OW professionals, that we have a specialty, but we have to be curious about all those other things, so that we're keen on integrating them together, because we know our adversaries will, and we know the domain is integrated. And so we become that, like I said, the thought leaders for integration, but we're also the ones that kind of blend the experience and the mindset of an intelligence professional or a cyber professional and operations professional, that we kind of throw that aside and just say, hey, we're all here. We think of ourselves as radicals, right? We think of Delta 11 radicals because no one's ever fought a war in space, and we've got to envision it, create the environments for it, and create the aggressors for it. And that requires radical thinking, to do radical things that no one's thought to do before, even in what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And so you kind of shed your background and adopt that kind of mindset in this Delta, and figuring out what's the best way we can make blue better. And that's what we're all about.
Sir, copy that. Cross-career integration is really what helps define Delta 11. Colonel Pumroy, thanks for talking about that. Real quick, how can industry help out? Because I know they're chomping at the bit to help you out, to make sure you have the capabilities you need.
Yeah, so on the NSTTC side, as I mentioned, we're not carving out space on orbit for a range. It's really about the ability to maintain constant or persistent observation of a portion of space, collect that data, fuse that data, condition that data, and bring it to a display to make decisions. And so I think from an industry standpoint is we're really interested in sensors, optics, radars that can refine our understanding and drive down the error that we would have in terms of what we're looking at, and have more confidence in that data. And then kind of expanding the horizons beyond, okay, so we're interested in where objects are in placement to each other, but again, how do we collect data in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum? How do we collect data in terms of any other kind of emissions we're concerned about on orbit? And then again, condition that into and have an understanding of what's happening on orbit so that we learn, right? And so I think from an industry standpoint, that's where I would see a lot of the focus going is increase our ability to understand, maintain awareness, maintain persistence, and drive down the error in those data so that's as perfect as we can possibly get.
And that's through the first, from what I understand, the first integrated program office.
Right. And so STARCOM, in a partnership with Space Systems Command, has set up its first integrated program office where we have professionals from both field comms working the acquisition strategies and the acquisition process for our range capacities and our aggressor capacities. And it's so far been really successful in terms of their ability to move fast, in terms of their agility, and it's probably forming a great model for the rest of the Space Force to follow, in my opinion. But they're the ones that are working to be clear on what our needs are, what we're building to, kind of establishing the roadmap for the types and capabilities of sensors and the ways in terms we're going to collect data and understand data. And then they will work with industry to figure out how we fill those needs and fill those requirements. And then we just become the voice of the operator back to the integrated program office or the IPO to make sure that what we're going after seems executable on our end, and that range controllers and aggressors can operate consistently with what the IPO is looking to acquire and build for our range.
Colonel Pumroy, I know there's a potential for people who are excited about what's happening in the private sector and potentially want to leave the Space Force. What do you tell kids to keep them really energized about this important mission that you're doing there at Delta 11?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that our folks come to me often about, to where what they see is there's opportunities on the outside and there's no way that the Space Force is going to be able to match the pay that some of these companies and industry are paying right now. But I think where there is opportunity there, and what we really drive after is, for a lot of people, and when you're serving, it shouldn't be about the money, right? It should be about service. You want to serve the nation. Now, you might be enticed by money when you're not enjoying your experience and there's opportunities outside. But the one thing that's unique about military experience is either seeing combat for real, which hopefully we never have to do in space, but having realistic combat experiences that you're never going to have in industry, right? No one working for SpaceX launching is going to say, oh, I really enjoyed having that realistic fight with this adversary. But in the Space Force, if we do it right, we'll have range environments and a force generation model that brings Guardians into a realistic combat scenario where ultimately, if they do their job right, they succeed. And feeling like you just beat an adversary that was trying to kill you in space, and knowing that you survived and you beat them, I think that's worth more than money to somebody who wants to serve their nation and know that they have that confidence that if China or Russia comes after them, they're ready and they can defeat that. And I think if we can build routine experiences where you have realistic combat experience, where that stress, right, that anxiety of, if I lose, this would be losing for real if I lose in this environment. And if you lose, then you learn from it. And then if you win, you get that exhilaration from knowing you can defeat the enemy and doing that over and over again. I think that if we can build that experience in for the Guardian and have, routine combat-like experiences of what fighting will look like in space and through space, I think that would be a great way to retain talent, because you keep all the people that are less interested about the pay and more interested in defeating China or Russia. I think where we're going to have trouble is if our Guardians don't have those experiences, then yes, their experience isn't going to be that much different than what they get in industry. So of course you're just going to go after the bigger paycheck. But I think that's what the Space Force is looking to do with our advanced training models, our fourth generation models, and if we continue to do that, I think that we'll retain the right talent in that scenario of the people that want to serve, want to learn how to fight, and want to credibly protect the nation.
Sir, that's a great point about retention and providing those experiences that they can only experience as a DoD military service member. Sure, thanks so much again for your time today and what you're doing there leading Delta 11. And I look forward to talking with you as this mission continues to evolve and develop. On behalf of the entire Space Force Association, sir, thank you for your service and have a great Space Force day. Semper Supra.
You too. Thanks, Hippie. We'll see you.
See you.